is Shashi Verma. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Transport for London. I've worked for TfL for the last 21 years, but my professional journey started in India. I graduated from IIT Kharagpur in 1993, and I spent the first 2 years of my career working in India. Interestingly, I had a degree in agricultural engineering, but very quickly I moved from agricultural engineering into real estate and infrastructure. This was at a time when the Indian economy was opening up, and people were investing in new sectors. My company was investing in quite a big project in Hyderabad in real estate. And we used the opportunity of some very unique real estate opportunities to pitch the idea of turning Hyderabad into a high-tech city. So that is something on which I had a contribution back in 1993. And Hyderabad looks very different today, 30 years later. But back in those days, Hyderabad had a very limited economy, with gems and jewelry being the primary trade. That work was transformational. It is what became the basis of Hyderabad transitioning into a high-tech economy and becoming a competitor to Bangalore. So that gave me some ideas about the role of public policy, and I ended up going to Harvard to study public policy at the Kennedy School. I got a master's. I was working partway through a PhD and got bored with it. I spent a year teaching at Harvard as well, but I left all of that to go and work for McKinsey and Company in London as a consultant, and did that for 3 years. But for the last 21 years after McKinsey, I've been working at Transport for London. My journey in TfL itself has been fascinating, to me at least. I started off with building a corporate finance team, looking at the financing of major projects, ended up running major projects, including the biggest one that TfL has done ever, which is the Crossrail project, which is now running operationally as the Elizabeth Line. The piece of work that I did there, very substantial piece of work, transformed the way we look at transport economics. Brought in this new theory called agglomeration economics. That became the basis of justifying the business case for Crossrail. It also led to very innovative financing and funding mechanisms, more so in funding than in financing, with property and business rates. Business rates is a form of property taxation in the UK, becoming a major source of income that paid for the cost of Crossrail. And it's a very unusual thing among transport projects around the world. In fact, very few examples of that kind exist anywhere. So very innovative work got done on Crossrail that led to the project being successful, turning it from an idea into a project. But I worked on many other projects during that period. But from 2006 onwards, I took charge of the Oyster card system, which is the main fare collection system, the largest smart card in the world, the most popular by far, and very, very sophisticated. So I started making Oyster card a success, which is why it's known around the world now. But very soon after I started running Oyster, we started looking at the idea of open payments. And so open payments are actually created inside TfL. It's not actually a banking industry creation. So created inside TfL to solve a problem of fare collection in transport, but it has become the basis of payments around the world. Well, the creation of Transport for London itself recognized a need to integrate transport. Like most places in the world, there was a high degree of fragmentation in the delivery, planning and delivery of transport in London as well. So the creation of TfL was aimed at addressing this problem. So 14 different transport organizations came together to make Transport for London. And with a few exceptions, we control pretty much anything that moves in London. So this is a very high degree of integration, which is matched perhaps only by Singapore. So the issue here was that so many of the conditions for success of TfL were laid at its foundation. And without that degree of integration, had we still had the multiple organizations running transport, many of the successes that we've seen in London would just not have been possible. But in addition to that, there is a clear recognition that we are uh, we derive our mandate from a democratic process. The mayor is our boss. He's the chairman of Transport for London. He's elected every 4 years on a manifesto, and it's our job to make sure that the manifesto in which he's elected is actually fulfilled. Along with the creation of TfL and the Office of the Mayor of London, there was a planning framework that was established that integrates land use, transport, health, environment into a sort of interlocking set of policies. And that planning framework has been very helpful in bringing the kind of joined up thinking and the integration that has existed in London. So I think it's a combination of multiple factors, and many things have to come true to make organizations like Transport for London successful. But the integration, the planning framework, and the very clear recognition that this is very much subject to a democratic process is important. Well, I think there is a huge challenge of urbanization in India. In fact, India has the biggest urbanization challenge of any country around the world. There is a question to be asked, which is, what are we trying to achieve by urbanization? Whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. But if we had to direct policy and political attention to urbanization, what problem is it that we are trying to solve? Because if it is simply a question of accommodating people who are coming in from rural areas, then that's a very limited objective. In my view, cities exist because they allow productive activity to happen together. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't be living in cities. And therefore, cities are one of the biggest instruments of productivity growth that this country is ever going to have. And that's not to take away from the investment in infrastructure or in manufacturing and other activities of that kind that also enhance productivity. But you have to remember that many of those activities will end up in cities. And therefore, the shape, the design, the structure of cities has to be done very carefully to enhance the productivity potential and not become a barrier in achieving productivity. It's something that is not understood, and that's why the quality of urbanization in India has actually been very substandard. There's been urban sprawl. There's not been enough investment in the things that would make cities efficient. Transport being one of the key elements in that. But the whole issue of how you look at transport and land use together to derive efficiency is very important. So if you look at a very limited objective, just climate change alone, right? Because you could look at climate change, you could look at air quality, you could look at congestion. There are many objectives that you have to fulfill. But if you looked at climate change alone, then the number of policy options that you have to achieve the climate change goals are actually very limited. You could move from dirty fuels to clean fuels. That's one way of achieving things. You could move from energy-intensive operations to more energy-efficient operations. And so, a lot of focus around the world when it comes to climate change has been on supply-side economics, which is how to change the fuel mix and achieve climate objectives that way. But the reality is that if you were to move people out of cars and into public transport, even if it's the same fuel type, you achieve an efficiency improvement and an improvement in climate change goals just by moving people into public transport. And in fact, the power of that is not to be underestimated. And you call that demand side controls. I mean, I'm not saying suppress demand, but by moving demand to more efficient forms of transport that have a lower impact on climate change is one of the big instruments by which goals can be met. It happens to be the case that if you want to go after air quality and pollution, it's also the same instruments. Moving people out of cars into the metros or into buses or into walking and cycling, that is the mechanism by which you can get cleaner air. If you're looking at other objectives, safety, for example, right? Again, moving people out of private vehicles into public transport is a way of enhancing safety. The worst safety outcomes are for pedestrians and for people on two-wheelers. If you could move people out of two-wheelers into public transport, that's great. If it creates more space for pedestrians, and you could provide better pedestrian facilities, that also enhances safety. So whether you look at climate change or air pollution or safety, I should also add health. One of the problems that every country around the world is facing is of a sedentary lifestyle. And private vehicles, whether that's two-wheelers or four-wheelers, encourage a sedentary lifestyle. Whereas if you're in public transport, there's a minimum amount of exercise that you get every day just by virtue of having to access public transport. You walk from home to your bus stop, home to a metro station, you go up and down the stairs and all that. So, it doesn't matter which problem you're trying to address. Better public transport is an answer to many of those problems. Now, you may think that having your own car gives you a degree of freedom and a degree of flexibility and all that. But remember, it also brings all of these externalities. And some of those externalities are not to other people. Some of those are to yourself, except that you don't realize it. Well, I mean, this is an academic institution, and I have no doubt that some of the incentive structure for people who are here is to research and publish and do things of that kind. But it's also, a bridging institution between academia and industry. And I think it's very important to understand the needs of the industry, the needs of policymakers. Freight and logistics, for example, is driven mainly by a very commercial industry, although there is government input into it. Public transport and urban mobility is driven very much by policy action. So being able to provide the policymakers with the right kind of advice and support and research into what makes things work better in urban mobility is important. That is a function that centers like this one can and should fulfill, but it's something that can only be done by engaging in the policy debate. You have to get your hands dirty with policy making. But if you want to have an impact, then there is no substitute to engaging in that messy process.